Hi friends, I'm Chelsea Grayson coming to you once again from the Office of the CEO. This is my show where I can help you be more successful in your current career, and I can also help you successfully transition to a new career. Today I wanted to give you guys a quick reminder as we get to the end of 2020 and what a year this has been, to always plan for risk. And that can mean sometimes predicting and preventing risk, so preempting whatever the risk is that you foresee. And sometimes it could just mean planning to respond to risk, things that you can't prevent necessarily, but you know that ultimately they're going to happen. And this is something that everyone should be proactively engaged in, whatever rung of the ladder that you're at, whether you are an entrepreneur and you are running your own company, whether you are in leadership at someone else's company, whether you are the most junior employee at a company, right? You should always be thinking about what potential risks are there that could come down the pike and damage either the part of the business that I'm in, the company as a whole, the country as a whole, or even what are the global impacts of potential risk. And what can I do to try to either prevent that, or what can I do to be ready to respond to that? Believe me, even if, again, you are the most junior employee at your company, if you have this conversation with your boss, even if it's just an informal conversation at the end of a call about something else, he or she will absolutely respect that you've brought it up and will really appreciate any ideas that you bring to the table. So really what I want to do in this episode is just sort of brainstorm and give you guys a bunch of ideas of the sorts of risks that I think that have occurred over the years or that might occur moving forward that maybe you guys ought to start to think about. Some of these things might be totally irrelevant to your business. Some of them might be spot on. And a lot of these things are risks that have actually already happened, but things that could recur. And so here goes. So for one thing, we all know, right as I record this, we're about a week ahead of the 2020 presidential election. We all know that no matter who wins, who is perceived to win, whatever happens with that process, there is going to be post-election fallout one way or the other. We know that people's emotions are absolutely tied to this election, a lot of big stakes one way or the other, no matter which side you sit on. So think about what post-election fallout might occur, whether that's social protest, rioting, whether it is any sort of effect on Wall Street, whether some sort of bigger impact on the economy, is it some sort of impact on international relations? Is there going to be a government shutdown depending on whether there's a peaceful transition or not, if that's relevant? Start to think about potential post-election fallout and think about whether or not that particularly impacts your business. For example, if you're a retailer and you still have brick and mortar locations and those are open or closed, you're going to want to think about protecting those brick and mortar locations specifically because we know that there might be some activity out on the street. So post-election fallout, again, related to that, we know that we've seen all sorts of social protest this year. That's not going to go away. The issues that underlie that social protest, of course, continue to exist along with lots and lots of other issues. And so we know that there will continue to be protesting in connection with social movements moving forward. So think about how you can prepare for that risk. We know that we've had the pandemic, right? And we know that we are going to have continuing fallout and impact from the pandemic, whether it's businesses having to shut down again because there's a resurgence, whether it's businesses staying open, but there's a rise in the occurrence of the virus. Maybe it's an offshoot of the pandemic. There's another strain of the virus that happens. Maybe there's a completely different pandemic. I think that most scientists would agree that we're probably going to start to see more and more of this as the world sort of gets more and more connected and people are out there more in the world. Granted, we're all going to start to take more and more precautions as we move forward, things that we haven't done before. Traveling with masks, for example, is probably going to become the norm. But yet and still, I think most scientists would agree that we're probably going to see more pandemics as we move forward into the next few years. At your own company, what about CEO succession planning? What happens when the CEO decides to transition out of the office? What happens if you have a radical transition of the CEO out of the office? So for example, what if there is a hashtag Me Too circumstance where the board has to decide overnight that they must terminate the CEO for cause because of some sort of hashtag Me Too situation, right? That happened to me at American Apparel, of course. We know that Doug Charney was the founder and CEO of that company, and we had to terminate him for cause based on allegations of sexual misconduct and misuse of corporate funds. And we had to scramble and find a new CEO. Ultimately, I ended up taking that seat, but that was a very radical CEO succession. At Sears, we know that Eddie Lampert, the CEO of Sears, many, many years ago, was actually kidnapped off the street. Now, thank goodness he was released and he wasn't harmed. But what if that happens to the CEO of your company? Depending on how that situation ends up, you might have to find yourself scrambling for a new CEO. So it's not all, CEO succession planning is not always about, well, we know in 5 years this CEO is planning to retire, or we know that in the natural order of things, we're going to have to figure out who's going to take her place. Sometimes this stuff happens in a really radical and catastrophic way. And that's a risk that every company needs to absolutely be watching out for and be prepared for. It's no excuse not to be prepared for that sort of a thing. What about cybersecurity? What about hacking issues, right? So what if you have a cybersecurity breach? We know that it's happened a lot. It's happened so much that there's actually some insurance companies that issue cybersecurity insurance policies these days. So it's relevant enough and it's prevalent enough that there's insurance to guard against that, but it doesn't guard against all of the liabilities that can happen. I mean, the biggest one of all being class action lawsuits by people whose information was leaked, right? So think about shoring up your cyber protection and getting cybersecurity insurance for your company. Taking a look at my notes here. What about climate change related risk, right? So we know that now more than ever, there are hurricanes and storms, but even more relevant, we know that cold weather is getting more cold, hot weather is getting more hot. So I sit here in California and we know that this year we had a horrific fire season. It's probably not even over and I'm sitting here in October. That's totally related to climate change. What about extreme cold? I sit on the board of a company that is partially in the agriculture business. So, and some of our grows are outside and they're very much affected by the elements. And in one of our grows in one of our states, we had an extremely cold night and we had to have all of our workers in the field putting heaters in the field in order to heat the crop and make sure that we didn't lose an entire harvest. So what about earthquakes? Again, I'm sitting here in California, right? I mean, on the East Coast and in the South, they've got hurricanes. We've got earthquakes. That has nothing to do with climate change. It's just sort of an environmental risk. You know you're going to have earthquakes. You know you've absolutely got to retrofit in preparation for those. We know the big one is coming at some point. What are you doing to prepare for things like that? I'll give you a quick anecdote. Back when I was a lawyer, as you know, I'm a recovering lawyer. I used to be a partner in Jones Day. I ran the California mergers and acquisitions practice. And I was representing a client of mine that was buying a chemical plant that sat on the island of Galveston, off the shore of Houston. And we were looking to buy this chemical plant, and we were about ready to sign a binding letter of intent when we decided to go in and do physical diligence on Galveston of this chemical plant. And we went, and the client sort of took a look and kicked the tires and just sort of said, I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure I want to sign the letter of intent. I need to give it sort of a week and figure out, how this really fits into my portfolio of assets. Well, guess what happened in the next week after we all left Galveston? A huge hurricane hit. From space, you couldn't even see the island of Galveston. And of course, the chemical plant that my client was looking to buy was utterly and completely destroyed. They would have been the owners of absolutely nothing had we actually done that deal. So that is a situation where weather, where the environment, where climate can actually come in and completely decimate whatever your plans were. So one way or the other, make sure and prepare for that as much as you can, whether it's with insurance, whether it's with retrofitting, whether it's making sure that you diligence where you're going to have a physical facility and make sure that there's not extreme weather that could come in and destroy that physical facility. One way or the other, prepare for that sort of risk. Terrorism. Now, not a lot of people thought about this as a risk, particularly in the sense of domestic terrorism, until the unfortunate events of 9/11 happened. Now everyone thinks about it, and I am concerned that because of this pandemic, people are now thinking about future pandemics or even cyber hacking more than they're thinking about another incident of domestic terrorism, whether it's going to come from outside or whether it's domestic terrorism that's perpetrated by a United States citizen. It's absolutely something that you need to think about and prepare for, including, as we all know, on-site shooter plans. So continue to think about that as a risk and don't let it get brushed to the wayside, even though we're thinking about all sorts of other issues now. Domestic terrorism, wherever it comes from, is still absolutely an issue as we move forward. What if there's a mass exodus of your employees? What if, for whatever reason, culture breaks down or something happens where a significant number of your employees decide that they're going to leave, even if it's in trickles, not in one particular group? What are you going to do? Do you have a recruiting firm at the ready? Can you replace people? Is there something you can do now to shore up your corporate culture to make sure that you don't have a big group of employees that decides to leave because of some issue that has not been fixed, right? Prepare for what happens if disgruntled employees decide to leave en masse, and try to prevent that by fixing whatever the issue is that's making them disgruntled. Along those lines, culture crisis, right? Try to prevent culture crisis as much as you can, of course, by having a proper code of conduct in place and by having everyone sign on to the code of conduct and agreeing not to bully, not to intimidate, not to sexually harass, not to racially discriminate, not to do, not to engage in bribery or fraud. I mean, all of those sorts of things that we think are sort of naturally come to you as a human being. If you have a good code of conduct in place and everyone has signed it, then you can really set the tone from the top and help to prevent toxic culture. But if you have a culture crisis, what are you going to do to help to prevent worse fallout from that, right? Do you have good PR firm? Do you have a good investor relations firm on staff? Do you have a good communications plan at the ready, right? Do you have a good, is your HR department set up so that they can handle if a corporate culture crisis comes down the pike? All of those, right? A brand crisis, reputational damage, right? What if something happens generally, the CEO makes a bad communication to the public, you have a foible in one of your marketing efforts, something happens to damage the reputation and the brand halo of your company. Again, same thing, good PR and good IR, good communications plan ahead of time can really help to preempt what sort of damage happens from that, but also training ahead of time so that people understand the things to do and not to do and the right channels to go through before they do things on behalf of the brand. Those are the sorts of things that can help to prevent reputational and brand crisis. Disruption in the market generally. Right? What if there's a newcomer? What if you've been engaged in your business forever and ever and ever? You're too big to fail. And then there's a newcomer, whether it's a new sort of product, whether there's a new company that comes in and starts to do this better, and they come from absolutely out of left field. I mean, I sat on the board of Delta Dental, for example, age-old dental insurance company. All of a sudden there was market disruption where people could go and get their teeth whitened, at a brick and mortar location just on the street. You could walk in and get your teeth whitened and at the same time get a breath freshener and maybe a teeth cleaning. Invisalign, you don't have to go to the dentist anymore to get braces. You can order braces online and get them. You can get all your teeth replaced at a cosmetic dentist. I mean, it all of a sudden became the norm that traditional dental care and traditional dental insurance as a related matter maybe wasn't going to be as prevalent any longer. So you really have to think about what happens when there is market disruption. Same thing, what about Borders and Barnes and Noble? Booksellers that have been around for a really long time, and all the little mom and pop booksellers for that matter, and all of a sudden here comes Amazon. Here comes Kindle. What about Eastman Kodak, who made film for years and ignored the fact that digital was coming as the next wave of popular product in terms of photography and videography. So always think about disruption in the market and always be innovating and have your R&D department always proactively working to come up with that next idea or not to miss the idea when it starts to hit as the next wave. And the last one I want to talk about today is compliance risk. So you might be sitting in a regulated industry, right? You might be sitting in the healthcare industry, let's say the energy industry, the insurance industry, There's all sorts of industries that have very specific regulations that have to be followed. Even just a public company that's not in a regulated industry, as a public company, has to follow securities rules, for example, right? So think about what sorts of regulations, rules and procedures, whether handed down by the federal, state, or local government, apply to your company, and make sure you've got a good compliance department, and make sure that everyone in the company understands just how important it is to comply with those regulations, and make sure that you are monitoring that. Also make sure that, God forbid, someone violates and fails to comply with one of those regulations, that you can show that you tried your hardest to comply, that your intent was always to comply, and be able to show how you are managing that non-compliance, what you are doing to fix that and prevent it in the future. So always be at the ready. Listen, there's a ton more risk that you guys need to watch out for. It's really your job to sit there and brainstorm and whiteboard it a little bit and figure out what particularly applies to your company, and try to plan for it as much as possible. Again, either by attempting to prevent the risk from hitting your company, or just having a plan in place to respond when the inevitable happens. Again, at any level that you sit at in your company, whether you are the founder and CEO down to the most recent, most junior employee, it is imperative you be thinking about this for the future of your organization, which is important to everyone at every level of that company. And I really want you to start to think about this as we get to the end of 2020 and we turn the bend and get to the beginning of 2021, where one thing is for certain: any and all risks are going to hit all of us. I think that is one thing that we have come to learn from 2020. So hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Please drop me a comment, let me know what you think, and be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss another episode. I will see you next time from the Office of the CEO.